So here we are once again with our apple. Remember, we have the first sort of layer and a half on here. So my next step is going to be to just erase some of those pencil lines before I start adding too many layers on top of them, because they will not completely be covered up in certain areas. And I feel like I have enough of a layer, and I'm used to looking at my image enough that I don't necessarily need a line telling me exactly where some of these things are going to be. If you feel like you still need your lines, then absolutely feel free to leave those until you feel confident with erasing them. There is absolutely nothing wrong with keeping those lines a little bit longer. So now I've still got all my reflected light in there. I've got my highlights in there. But now when I go in with the rest of that second layer, or going into my next colors, I have a little bit more freedom because I don't have to avoid my pencil lines as much. But I do still want to make sure that I avoid putting any unwanted value in those areas that are meant to be lighter. So what I'm going to do now is just look at the bottom portion of my apple on my reference image. If you look here, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but there's a lot of purple in that bottom portion of my crab apple. So I'm going to go ahead and get some of that purple in towards this bottom portion. Very similarly to how I did this, but it's going to start just a little bit above this area and kind of go up from the reflected light into that red. Still going to leave the reflected light white. Still looking at my reference image, just as much as, if not more than, the paper on which I am working. Still going very, very light with that purple. Because I don't want it to overpower the red. What I want to have happen is, as I continue to layer up the purples and the reds, those colors will sort of mix and merge and create the different value transitions that I see, because essentially red and violet will make a red violet, which will then look like a darker portion of the apple sort of receding into that space. Because as we have discussed, your cooler colors are going to recede. So when you have a cool color mixed in with a warm color like red, that still remains true, and that cooler red will go further back than the brighter, warmer red. So in some of these areas, I might use yellows and whites and red-orange and things like that, whereas in my shadow areas, I'll use greens and purples and maybe even some blue. So here I've got a little bit of purple above the red. So I'm going to fade down into the red on this part and then fade up into the white on this side, knowing that eventually it's not going to be white there. But right now it is, but I still want to make sure that value and that color shift happen and that they happen smoothly. So still keeping my lines curved to enhance the roundness of that apple without flattening it. So your first several layers are going to be very, very light. And that does not mean that you should avoid saturation and darker values and colors. It simply means that you definitely want to build them up rather than just jump right in with them, especially toward the beginning. The more you get used to using multiple colors in the colors, the easier that will become and probably the faster you can work. But towards the beginning, take everything very slow. Really spend some time looking at your reference image, looking at your paper, and thinking about the colors that make up the colors that you are seeing. So again, keeping those lines curved, very much like we did when we did our sphere shading. It's almost the exact same concept here. Because eventually this area will be my core shadow. So I do want to make sure that I start to layer it up and build it up, because it's eventually going to be pretty dark. Right now it's not, but eventually it will be. So I want to make sure I'm aware of that and starting to get some smoother, solid layers in there. So once again, that directional line, moving with sort of the grain of the apple, so to speak. Keeping those lines nice and close together so that they create a value and a color rather than just a whole bunch of lines. Let me move and make the lights come back on. There we go. So looking at my reference image, I noticed that there's more purple on this side than there is on this side of the apple. This side of the apple is darker, but it's more of a brownish, greenish red, whereas this side has a little more purple. So I'm going to go ahead and go in with some brown and green on this side while I'm thinking of that, to kind of neutralize the purple a little bit and go ahead and start building up the layers that will achieve the values and the colors that I need on that side. Definitely still keeping with my directional line. And remember, I'll go back over it with my red to get it back to more of that red apple. And then you'll almost just kind of feel the colors that are under it more than you see them. I know that sounds a bit strange, but that's kind of the way that shading and coloring should work once you do get the hang of it. Because color, while it is an element of art, is also kind of something that we feel, but not in the same way that the principles are. So I'm just darkening this side, adding some more layers, getting some more of that brownish color in there that is in the red, and paying attention very specifically to which parts of my core shadow have that brown, and which parts have more purple, which parts have more red, so on and so forth. And then keeping everything nice and soft for now. Gonna go ahead and just darken this brown a little bit more. Remember to squint when you look at your reference image. That will really help you sort of pinpoint, especially where those darker values need to be. You can also change the contrast on your actual reference image to make it something that's a little bit higher contrast than what it actually is, to help you find some of those shadows a little bit better in dark spaces. You can have as many different versions of your image as you might need to be able to get all the different parts and pieces in there. That's totally fine. Nothing wrong with having 5 slides of the same image, but each one is just a little bit different for a different step of the shading process. So now I'm just kind of refining this edge that's above my reflected light, because it does get pretty dark and have a pretty clear defined edge here. So I'm going to go ahead and just get some pretty good saturation in there. With that brown. And then eventually we'll be going over that with the red as well. So that's starting to kind of get some form in there, starting to get more volume. Remember, this is only the 3rd color that I've used. I've got a handful more colors that I'm going to be using. And then one of the biggest things that I can remind you about is that you will not just use the color and be done. Most likely I'll use more red, I'll use more purple, I'll use more brown as I build up those layers. It's not like you have a brown layer, and a red layer, and a purple layer. Most likely you'll have multiple layers of each color that you use, but it won't necessarily be all over the entire image each time. You might only use a certain color in a very tiny little area, or you might use it all over the place, or like we've done with the red, you'll use it all over the place in some layers and not all over the place in other layers. You really just need to practice paying attention to what you see and where it is. So there's some brown here under that reflected light, kind of on the edge of it. So that's pretty good in terms of that first brown layer. I'm going to do a little bit more of my brown layer, and then the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and actually go in with a little bit of green in some of those pretty deep shadow areas of the red, and then also in some of the lighter areas of the part behind the stem where it just kind of is green, sort of as you get on the inside of the apple. So then once I do go back over with some of that green in some of those darker areas, that's going to increase the depth of those shadows. And then I would probably go back in with another red layer, kind of smoothing out all the different colors that I have so far before I add more.